At 28 minutes past 7 on a Saturday morning, a passenger ship rolled onto its side in the center of Chicago. It did not strike another vessel. It did not meet a storm. The water was almost still, and the ship was tied to a wharf so close that people on the upper deck could see the sidewalk. The Eastland had not begun its trip. More than 2,500 passengers and crew were waiting for an excursion across Lake Michigan. Then the deck leaned. Chairs moved. Water reached openings along the low side. Within about 2 minutes, the ship lay flat against the river, its port side underwater and its starboard side facing the sky. 844 people died. Many were trapped inside steel rooms that had turned 90 degrees around them. Others entered the river only a few yards from dry ground and could not reach it through the crowd. The short distance to land made rescue possible. It did not make escape simple. A later federal court placed the blame on one engineer and the way he handled the ballast tanks. The physical record is wider than that verdict. The Eastland had listed before. Its stability margin was small. Weight had accumulated high in the vessel, and the licensed passenger load filled several decks. The ballast system was one part of a ship already close to the edge. This is the Eastland disaster. A company picnic, a ship that could not hold itself upright, and a city trying to reach hundreds of people through the side of a hull. It is also the story of how a safety rule can enter an unsafe system, how legal responsibility can narrow, and how a catastrophe can disappear from national memory without ever leaving downtown. The passengers worked at Western Electric's Hawthorne Works in Cicero, west of Chicago. The plant made telephones, switchboards, and the equipment behind a growing national network. Its workforce included thousands of young men and women from immigrant neighborhoods nearby. For one Saturday each summer, the factory organized a picnic across the lake in Michigan City, Indiana. 7,000 tickets were sold for the 1915 outing. 5 steamers were chartered, with the Eastland scheduled to load first, cross the lake, and return in time for its regular afternoon business. Families left home before sunrise. They wore summer dresses, dark suits, and hats meant for photographs. Many carried food for a day that was supposed to feel nothing like work. The Eastland waited on the south bank of the Chicago River between Clark and LaSalle streets. The wharf stood among warehouses, office buildings, bridges, and morning traffic. This was not a remote terminal. A person walking through the loop could reach the ship in minutes. That ordinary location would put thousands of witnesses, rescuers, and improvised tools beside the disaster almost immediately. Boarding began around 6:30. An inspector counted passengers at the gangway and stopped the line at the licensed limit of 2,500. That number offered the appearance of control. It said how many people the certificate allowed. It did not answer the harder question: how much stability remained when those people occupied the upper decks of this particular ship? Phenomenon, the passengers were not a faceless crowd. They came in family groups and shop floor friendships. Some had crossed the Atlantic years earlier and built lives in Cicero, Berwyn, and the neighborhoods around the plant. On the dock, those private histories became one public mass of people moving through narrow gangways and searching for a good place to stand. The Eastland had been built at Port Huron in 1903. It was 265 feet long and only about 38 feet across the beam. A shallow draft suited rivers and lake ports. Several passenger decks gave excursion customers room and a view. Those choices also placed a great deal of structure and human weight above a comparatively narrow waterline. Stability is not the same as strength. A hull can be built from sound steel and still resist a roll poorly. When a vessel heels, the shape of the submerged hull shifts the center of buoyancy. If that shift creates enough leverage against the ship's weight, the vessel returns upright. If the leverage is weak, the ship lingers at an angle or keeps moving. Crews had seen the Eastland lean before. Its permitted capacity changed repeatedly during its operating life. The number had once been as high as 3,300 and was later reduced. Reports of hard lists followed the vessel between ports and owners. Each recovery could be read as evidence that the system worked. It could also be read as a warning that the margin was too small. Sailors used the word crank for a vessel that answered weight shifts too quickly. The word was not a full diagnosis, but it described the experience aboard. People moved and the deck answered. Ballast changed, and the response did not always settle where expected. An excursion ship spends much of its life with passengers walking toward views, music, and open air. That movement was part of its normal load. The Eastland was not waiting for one impossible loading condition. It was licensed to perform the job it was doing. The danger lay in how little room the system left between acceptable operation and loss of control. A certificate, a previous recovery, and a familiar routine all made the morning look safer than the ship's behavior suggested. The heaviest fixed machinery sat low, where weight helps a ship. But the Eastland also carried tall passenger spaces, upper deck fittings, and life-saving equipment. Every person who climbed a stair raised the combined center of gravity by a small amount. 2,500 passengers did not act as one solid block either. They gathered, separated, and moved through rooms connected by stairs and passageways. Naval architects describe part of the restoring margin through metacentric height. The name sounds abstract. The behavior is easy to see. A vessel with a healthy margin pushes back after a small heel. A vessel with a narrow margin feels slow or uncertain near upright, and can become dangerous as weight moves. Contemporary estimates for Eastland's margin varied, but nobody needed a perfect number to see repeated listing. The ballast tanks were the crew's main control. Water admitted low in the hull could lower the center of gravity and oppose a list. Water released or shifted could trim the vessel for changing loads. Yet ballast is not an instant command. Valves open, water moves, tanks fill at different rates, and the ship may continue changing while the correction is still underway. That delay matters because the crew reacts to the angle they can see, not the angle the ship will have when the water reaches its destination. Add too little and the list remains. Add too much or distribute it poorly and the correction can create a new imbalance. A system like this requires both a stable vessel and time to understand what each action has done. The later court record treated the ship as seaworthy if properly handled. That sentence carried enormous legal weight. Physically, it describes a vessel whose safety depended on correct handling while thousands of people moved above the tanks. The difference is important. A design can satisfy a rule and still demand more precision from operators than normal service reliably provides. 3 years before Eastland, Titanic sank with too few lifeboats for everyone aboard. The loss changed public expectations and federal law. Section 14 of the Seamen's Act expanded requirements for lifeboats, rafts, and trained boat crews. The safety provisions took effect on July 1, 1915, little more than 3 weeks before the Eastland disaster. The purpose was clear. When a ship could no longer float, passengers needed a place to go. The rule answered the failure everyone had just witnessed in the North Atlantic. It did not ask every older vessel the same second question with equal force. What happens to stability when boats, rafts, davits, and related equipment are added high above the waterline? On the Eastland, additional life-saving weight joined a structure that was already sensitive. The equipment did not invent the ship's proportions or its earlier lists. It moved the combined center of gravity in the wrong direction, a rule intended for the moment after a sinking had changed the vessel during every minute before one. That does not make the Seamen's Act the cause of Eastland. The law entered an inspection system that continued to certify the vessel for 2,500 passengers. Owners, inspectors, designers, and crews operated through different pieces of the problem. Each could point to a requirement satisfied somewhere else. Nobody held the full behavior of the loaded ship in one view. The clean version of this story says Titanic produced more lifeboats, and more lifeboats capsized Eastland. The record is less tidy. Added topside weight mattered. So did the vessel's geometry, its history, passenger loading, and ballast response. The irony remains, but it belongs inside a chain. Taking it out of that chain turns explanation into a slogan. At the wharf, the certificate mattered more than any theoretical argument. Boarding continued until the counter reached 2,500. People filled the main deck, cabins, and upper spaces. Some moved toward the riverside for air or a better view. Others went below to escape the crowd. The load was legal, distributed, alive, and constantly changing. An inspector could count bodies at the gangway. He could not measure the combined center of gravity with each family in place. The ship's certificate converted a complicated stability question into a number a person could enforce with one hand. Once the number was reached, the line stopped. The uncertainty inside the hull did not. The Eastland was also expected to keep a schedule. It would carry the first group to Michigan City, return across the lake, and make a regular afternoon run. Schedule pressure does not need a shouted order to matter. It lives in the plan, the charter price, the waiting ships, and the assumption that a familiar departure will happen on time. By this point, the vessel had already shown movement. The deck had leaned toward the wharf during boarding, then been corrected. A list that disappears can feel like a solved problem, but correction is evidence of the control that was needed, not proof that the underlying margin had grown. The same people and equipment remained aboard. Nothing outside the ship demanded departure. There was no weather closing in and no emergency on the river. The pressure came from ordinary operations meeting a condition nobody had named as a stop point. How much list was too much? How many corrections were too many? A system without a clear threshold can normalize each warning separately until the warnings become one event. Around 6:41, while passengers were still boarding, the Eastland leaned towards starboard, the side nearest the wharf. The crew admitted water to ballast tanks to bring it back. The angle eased. Boarding continued. The first clear warning and the first successful correction arrived together, making it possible to remember only the success. After 7, the loading count reached its limit. The ship then began leaning the other way, toward port and open river. Ballast was adjusted again. Passengers shifted through the decks as the angle changed. Some accounts describe people treating the early movement lightly. That reaction would be understandable. Excursion vessels move. The wharf was beside them. The crew was still working. The crew faced a feedback problem with no stable baseline. Passenger distribution was changing above, water was moving below. Mooring lines restrained the hull at the edge. Each visible angle reflected several actions that had started at different times. When the vessel returned partway toward level, nobody could know from the deck alone whether it had settled or merely passed through. As the port list increased, openings on that side moved closer to the river. A watertight hull can survive a severe angle longer than a hull with doors, gangways, and windows near the water. The danger was no longer only whether the ship could right itself, it was whether the river would enter before it did. At 7:25, the final sequence was close. The Eastland remained tied to the wharf, full of passengers and unable to hold level. This is where hindsight makes every remaining second look like an obvious chance to evacuate. On board, the available choices were harder. Moving thousands of people through limited exits could shift the load faster than the ballast could answer. The final roll began slowly enough to be seen and too quickly to be controlled. The port rail moved down. Furniture and loose objects began sliding. People reached for fixed surfaces, each movement adding new weight to the low side. Gravity had become part of the crowd flow. The ship was no longer carrying passengers across a deck. It was carrying them down one. When the low openings entered the river, water moved into the vessel. That water did not wait for a pump or instruction. It added mass on the side already going down, crossed floors that were becoming walls, and filled spaces people were trying to leave. The last restoring margin disappeared inside a feedback loop that accelerated itself. At about 7:28, the Eastland went onto its port side. The starboard side rose into the air. Mooring lines stayed attached as the vessel settled against the riverbed. From the wharf, the ship had changed from a place with decks and rooms into a steel wall. From inside, floors, doors, and stairs no longer led where they had a minute earlier. The water was only about 20 feet deep. That fact kept the entire ship from disappearing, but it created a cruel division. People on the exposed side climbed onto the hull or were pulled toward the wharf. People on the low side and inside compartments were underwater or behind steel. The same shallow river that exposed part of the vessel sealed another part. No film of the actual roll is known. The photographs begin after the Eastland is already on its side, surrounded by boats and people. The missing image matters. It keeps the final movement from becoming entertainment. What remains is evidence of the geometry afterward. Hull beside wharf, survivors on steel, rescue craft pressed into a river crowded with debris, the dock filled with people who could see where help was needed. They threw boards, ladders, ropes, and anything that would float. Small boats moved alongside the wreck. Workers broke windows and reached through openings now turned sideways. The rescue began before any command structure could form because the disaster had happened inside a city already full of hands and tools. Access was the central problem. A door that had been usable became a hatch above or below someone. A corridor became a vertical shaft. Furniture collected against the low wall. People near the exposed side could climb toward air. People deeper inside needed a path cut through the structure or cleared through water and debris. Cutting crews opened the exposed steel shell. Each opening carried a choice. Where could people be reached? What structure lay beneath? And how could a hole be made without sending more material into the compartment? The work was fast and improvised, but the hull still demanded engineering judgment. Rescue workers were building doors into a ship that no longer had usable ones. Nearby buildings became treatment spaces. Police, firefighters, nurses, physicians, and volunteers moved the injured away from the river while more people continued arriving to search. The proximity that had exposed the passengers to a dense city also placed stores, blankets, telephones, transportation, and medical help within reach. The location was part of both the disaster and the response. Rescue did not remain rescue for long. As reachable spaces were cleared, crews entered compartments where the water had settled and time had run out. The public record contains photographs of recovery, but this film will not use the dead as visual proof. The scale is established by the work, the records, and the number that the city had to carry. The 2nd Regiment Armory was turned into a temporary morgue. Families came through looking for people who had left home before sunrise. The work of identification stretched across languages, neighborhoods, and entire households. A company outing had concentrated loss among people who lived near one another, worked together, and often shared relatives on the same ship. The accepted final count is 844. Early official and legal records used different numbers as identification and claims moved through the system. That variation does not make the loss uncertain in the way a missing ship might. It shows how a city counts after families, employers, coroners, and courts begin from different lists. The concentration of young workers and families changed the shape of the loss. Some homes lost one wage earner, others lost parents, children, and siblings together. Streets around the Hawthorne Works received news house by house. The disaster did not end at the river. It moved west along streetcar and rail lines into the neighborhoods that had filled the ship that morning. The comparison with Titanic is often stated badly. Eastland did not kill more people in total. Titanic's crew losses made its overall toll much larger. Eastland did kill more passengers than the passenger toll commonly assigned to Titanic. That precise comparison matters because it shows the scale without borrowing another disaster's facts. The Eastland victims did not need Titanic to make their number important. 844 is large enough. The comparison helps explain memory, not worth. One event entered global culture through an ocean voyage, famous passengers, and a wreck on the seabed. The other happened beside office windows to factory families on a morning when the ship never moved forward. Chicago wanted an answer that could fit inside an indictment. The federal case named 6 men: company officers, inspectors, Captain Harry Pedersen, and Chief Engineer Joseph Erickson. The record asked who had known the ship was dangerous, who had certified it, who had authority that morning, and who had moved the ballast as the lists developed. The case moved from Chicago to Grand Rapids. The National Archives notes that the owners hoped for a friendlier setting. Clarence Darrow appeared for the defense. Before a jury could weigh the full catastrophe, the court had to decide whether the defendant should be sent back to Chicago for trial. Procedure narrowed the event before responsibility was ever argued in one room. No defendant was ultimately convicted for the deaths. That outcome should not be mistaken for a finding that the system had worked. Criminal law asks whether particular people can be proved guilty under particular charges. A disaster investigation asks how the conditions were allowed to exist together. Those questions can share evidence and still produce different answers. Civil proceedings lasted for years. In 1935, the Seventh Circuit upheld findings that focused negligence on the engineer's operation of the water ballast tanks. The same record described the vessel as seaworthy if properly handled and allowed the owner to limit liability because the negligence was found outside its knowledge. One conditional phrase carried most of the system's legal weight. Erickson had been below deck working the controls while passengers, water, and the vessel itself changed above him. He may have handled ballast badly. The court said he did. That does not explain why one operator's imperfect response could overturn a licensed ship at a wharf. Blame reached the control room and stopped. The design, certificate, and operating margin remained around it. Eastland did not produce one famous law bearing its name. The disaster entered a longer argument about passenger vessel stability, inspection, and the effect of life-saving equipment on older ships. It showed that counting boats and counting passengers could not substitute for understanding the loaded vessel as a moving system. The lesson is not that safety equipment is dangerous. The lesson is that a correction changes the system it enters. Add weight, alter routes, increase capacity, or change operating practice, and the original assumptions must be tested again. A fix designed around the last disaster can create a new exposure when nobody models the whole object afterward. Modern passenger vessels use stability calculations, operating limits, and inspection practices far more explicit than the hand counter at Clark Street. Yet the institutional temptation remains familiar. A certificate can turn a changing physical condition into a box already checked. Once that happens, the operator at the last control may inherit every assumption made before the shift began. This is why the legal and engineering stories should not be collapsed. The court needed a finding that allocated liability. Engineering needs an explanation that can prevent repetition. One can end with a name. The other has to keep tracing connections until the vessel, the rules, the load, and the people operating it appear in the same frame. Eastland's most useful warning is not about one old ship. It is about systems that work only while every correction arrives on time. When safety depends on constant adjustment, a normal delay can become a failure. When certification ignores that dependence, the paperwork may remain valid all the way to the moment the physical system leaves it behind. The wreck itself remained valuable. Salvage crews righted the Eastland, pumped it out, and moved it from the river. Photographs of the raised hull make the ship look damaged but recognizable, as if the event might be repaired along with the steel. The name could not be repaired. The vessel was sold and later acquired by the United States Navy. Wannalee mined med that finch Petershimman, a mined as a trading vessel. The same hull that had rolled at a picnic wharf spent decades under military control. That later service does not redeem the disaster or prove the original ship was sound. It shows how completely an object can outlive the public meaning attached to it. The Wilmette survived through the Second World War period and was eventually scrapped. By then, the physical Eastland was gone. The court cases had ended and the people who remembered the wharf were aging. The river kept its bridges and traffic. A disaster that had stopped downtown Chicago for one day became harder to see in the place where it happened. Memory often prefers a clean setting and a clear object. Titanic has an iceberg and an ocean. Eastland has a ballast system, a passenger certificate, upper deck weight, and a ship beside a sidewalk. Its causes are harder to hold in one image, even though the final photograph is brutally simple. The victims were workers and families on one day away from the factory. Their names did not travel through society pages or international passenger lists. Many were remembered intensely in the neighborhoods that lost them and lightly everywhere else. Forgetting was not complete. It was uneven, which can look complete from outside the communities that kept the date. Return to the wharf before 7:30. The ship is upright. The river is calm. Passengers are still boarding with tickets for a picnic. Nothing in the scene looks large enough to contain 844 deaths. That is what makes the record useful. Catastrophe did not arrive from outside. It assembled inside ordinary permission. The passenger count was permitted. The life-saving equipment answered federal law. The crew had corrected lists before. The ballast controls existed for this purpose. Each statement can be true on its own. Together, they describe a ship that still rolled over before departure. Safety failed in the space between the statements. Prevention would have required someone to treat repeated instability as a reason to stop, not another condition to manage. It would have required the license capacity to follow the vessel's real loaded behavior, and every added pound high on the decks to trigger a new stability question. Those are less dramatic actions than rescue. They are also the actions that keep rescue from becoming necessary. The Eastland lay beside the wharf for weeks, visible to anyone crossing the river. It was impossible to miss and still became a disaster many Americans cannot name. Remembering it means holding more than the photograph. It means keeping the ship upright long enough to see the rules, decisions, and small margins that were already aboard. 844 people left for a picnic and never left the dock. The Eastland did not need a storm, an iceberg, or open water. It needed a narrow margin, a full legal load, and corrections that could not catch up. If the forgotten deserve a witness and the pattern deserves to be remembered, subscribe. The next inquiry is already open.